You're listening to Navigating the French on Paris Underground Radio. For more great content and a bonus episode of Navigating the French, please join us on Patreon.
Hello, and welcome to Navigating the French, the podcast where each episode we take a look at a French word and try and see what it tells us about French culture. I'm your host, Emily Monaco. Today I'm joined by sisters and academics Christine and Tracy Adams. They're here to discuss a common false friend with roots linked to sex and power in the French courts, and that offers a glimpse at the way in which the French perceive of gender differences to this day. Favorite. So welcome to Tracy and Christine. Thank you both so much for joining me on the podcast today. Would it be possible for you to give our listeners a little bit of info about who you are and what you do?
Tracy, go ahead.
Okay, I'm a professor of European languages at the University of Auckland. I started as a literature specialist, early modern and medieval French, and then sort of got tired of literature and was just always much more interested in the people who wrote it and the things that the people that they were writing about than the actual literature. And so now I really specialize in queens and mistresses and regents of late medieval France and early modern France.
So I started as a historian. I am a historian primarily of 18th, 19th century France, although I sort of dip back into the 17th century as well. I teach at St. Mary's College of Maryland. And since it's a small school, I cover a wide range of European history classes, basically from the medieval to the present, which actually, in a way, is nice because it gives you sort of a broader perspective on things. I started as a family historian and have in recent years shifted more specifically to gender and women and the intersection of gender and politics, which makes the study of mistresses particularly important. At the moment, I'm working on a new project looking at a group of women that are usually called the merveilleuses, who come to the fore during the Directory, during the reign of the French Revolution, but still very interested in mistresses more generally.
Amazing. And I have to ask because I have two sisters. So you're sisters and you've worked together before and your sort of centers of interest overlap a little bit. What's it like to work in areas that kind of overlap like that? And what was it like to work together?
Fabulous. It's great.
You know each other. Yeah.
It's really good because you can bounce ideas off each other when you get together for other reasons. And we had thought about the fact that we'd like to work on a project together probably, 10, 15 years ago. And we started by working first on beauty and sort of the use of beauty as social capital. And we did a conference back in 2013 that dealt with that topic. And from that, we decided that we were really interested, particularly in women who were able to sort of parlay their physical attractiveness, but also their intelligence into more important political positions. And that sort of led us in the direction of working on the royal mistresses.
And just in a very practical way, we work well together because we both get things done when we say we will. So
Yes.
So we really work very well together.
That's amazing. Well, we're here, all of us, to discuss a word that I'm really excited to talk about because I always get super nerdy about false friends, false cognates in English and in French. And favorite is one that I think a lot of learners of French at the outset, they want to use as a replacement for favorite. That's rarely the word that one would use. Often we're going to use préféré. So préféré, it's a cognative preferred, but it does tend to mean favorite. In your experience, have you ever seen a case in which favorite is actually the appropriate translation for the English term favorite?
I'll take this one because I've been a French teacher. And you're absolutely right that when you teach your class how to say favorite in French, you teach them préféré. And it sounds more French than favori or favorite, the feminine version. But in fact, it's a word sort of like, I'll just take another one out of the air, the word concerné, another word that you would teach your students not really to use because you tell them the French don't really use that. They do something like préoccupé. And yet the words exist in French. So the word favori means exactly the same thing in French as it does in English. I was asking some French people the other day, when they say favorite, so the feminine version, what do they think of? Do they think of the mistress of the king? And they said, no, as a matter of fact, they're as unlikely to think, first of all, of that as we are to think of the favorite as the favorite of a king or a queen. So it's true that préféré sounds more French. They're probably more likely to use that word, but they do actually use the word favori in the same way that we do.
Okay.
I was just going to say that one place that I have seen favori or favorite used is in sports, it seems, that the person most likely to win.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
It comes out in that context. And so you do see it used in that way, but otherwise, yeah, exactly as Tracy said.
Okay. Yeah, that's I hadn't thought about that one, but absolutely. Now that you're saying it, it's definitely, on the rare occasion that I end up in a bar where some kind of sports ball is happening, I have heard that before. I think that a context where we do hear the word favorite, and specifically this feminine form being used quite a bit, is in reference to something that both of you are pretty big experts on, and this is this specific role within the European courts. We saw it in the film The Favorite, albeit with a heavy dose of fiction. But in the context of the French court, is the word favorite an equivalent, a pure translation of the word mistress? And if so, great. But if not, why not?
I'm not sure how we should divide this up because you've asked a really complex question.
Okay.
And we're going to need to talk about faveur and when that idea comes to be important in structuring the political life at the French court. The word favorite itself doesn't really show up as a synonym of the mistress of the king until the 17th century. So Chris will talk about that. But I wonder if I should talk a little bit about the word itself in the 16th century, which is when it actually starts to be used. And then I'll leave it to you, Chris, to talk about the embodiment of the favorite as the mistress. Does that sound okay?
Okay.
So two things. The first thing is that the word favorite is a person who's favored by the king or by the queen. The word is used indiscriminately for men or for women, but it isn't really used until after the middle of the 16th century. And before that point, you're much more likely to see the word mignon, which is minion in English, and it's used in English in the same way. So the mignons are the people who are especially favored by the king, who tend not to be people of the highest nobility. On the contrary, they're people who are made by the king. And so there's always a lot of conflict between the mignon and the highest nobility. And I think that that's probably pretty intuitive. I think that we feel that the favorites or the mignons are people who don't really deserve all the glory, all of the riches that they have. So that's one thing. So the word mignon or mignot are much more commonly used before the middle of the 16th century, even though the word favori or faveur has been in the French language since the 12th century, of borrowing straight from Latin. And then it passes into English, so you get the same word, meaning essentially the same thing in English. Same thing also in Italian. The word favore and favorita become common at about the same time. Where I've seen the word favorita as opposed to favorite earlier than in French or in English is in Italian. And you see Italian ambassadors writing about, for example, Anne Boleyn as the king's favorita. And you see the Duchesse de Valentinois, so Diane de Poitiers, referred to by Italian ambassadors as la favorita. But I've never seen either Anne Boleyn or Diane de Poitiers referred to as la favorite. That word comes in later. It's used as the king's mistress towards the end of the 16th century and then going into the 17th century. And just one other thing. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing that I think is really important if you're going to be talking about the favorite is the idea of faveur. So partiality or gifts from God, say. It's essentially the same word as grâce. Grace, favor mean essentially the same thing. And they are riches that can be bestowed on you indiscriminately by the king. So he has a perfect right to give his favor to anyone he wants. But you see a real shift happening in the late 16th century. And here, all of the knowledge I can convey here comes from an extremely important book called The Faveur du Roi by Nicolas Leroux. And what he talks about is its transformation in the idea of favor under King Henry III. And so to just make it very quick, what happens essentially is that prior to Henry III, the ideal is for the king to distribute his favor in an equitable way to all of the nobility so that the entire court will live like a family in great harmony under the benevolent father. With Henry III, you see a sort of transformation in the idea of favor so that it becomes clear That favor is something that belongs entirely to the king, and he can distribute it to whomever he wants, and without regard for, say, the high nobility. And that's going to cause a lot of conflict then through the next several hundred years. So I think those are important things to think about when you're going to start talking about la favorite. And I will leave it to Chris to talk about that figure.
Right. And by the time you get to Louis XIV, which is sort of where my work sort of picked up, the term la favorite very specifically does refer to the king's preferred mistress at that particular time. So in letters between Madame de Sévigné, for example, and her correspondence, or Bussy Rapitan, they refer to her as la favorite, or the maîtresse not en titre, but préférée. I mean, they use the term favorite specifically to mean the king's chosen mistress at that time. And that continues into the 18th century, that really becomes, I think, the term that is most frequently used by court watchers to refer to whoever happens to be the king's preferred mistress at that time. And in the court of Louis XIV, for example, you see discussion of women sort of fighting it out to become the king's favorite. And so certainly by the time we get to the late 17th century, that term seems to be very specifically associated with the mistress in that particular way. So some transformation in that happens clearly in the late 16th and early 17th century, where it does really make that shift.
Yeah, the earliest I've ever seen favorite referring to the mistress of the king is in retrospect about Diane de Poitiers in the memoirs of Gaspard de Saut-Tavannes. He refers to Diane de Poitiers. He's writing after the fact, so in the 1570s, and he refers to her as la favorite du roi. That's the earliest I've ever seen it. Montaigne does refer to what does he say exactly? He refers to la plus favorite des dames de sa cour in reference to the king, and he's making this sort of nasty little comment. It's in his essay Du Pédantisme, and he's writing about bizarre habits, people all over the world. And he says one of the strangest ones of our own is that quand le roi crache, la plus favorite des dames de sa cour tend la main. So when the king spits, the favorite of his ladies at the court stick out their hand to catch the spit. So it's not really the same thing, but you can kind of see towards the end of the 16th century kind of moving in that direction. Favori is really even not used for male favorites until Henry III. At that point, you really start to see that word used a lot. And prior to that, you see faveur a lot, but favorite is really a later. And actually, another place that you see it a lot is in Brantôme, and he's writing about the early 16th century, but he's writing in the very, very late 16th, early 17th century.
And does this always, when we say mistress, and I know we're talking about people like Anne Boleyn or people like Diane de Poitiers, we know that these people had amorous sexual relationships with the monarch. Is it always a sexual relationship that we're implying when we say favorite or favori?
The word maîtresse, actually, I'll throw this in and then Chris can take it away from there. But something important, I think, about the word maîtresse is that it does not mean an extraconjugal relationship, a long-term extraconjugal relationship, until at least the beginning of the 17th century. And before that, maîtresse means sweetheart, or it often means the woman that you are engaged to and you're going to marry. For example, Henry IV refers to Marie de Médicis as his maîtresse. He says, "You are my maîtresse, and you are soon going to exchange that title for another, ma femme. You're going to be my wife." But he also refers to Gabrielle d'Estrées as his maîtresse, ma maîtresse. But there isn't the necessity of a long-term extraconjugal relationship implied in that word. It just means sweetheart. Okay. And so Chris, why don't you go ahead then in the 17th century?
Yeah, I mean, it certainly does seem to be the implication when you are talking about a king and refer to his favorite. It seems to me that by the 17th century, that at least under Louis XIV, that would certainly be the implication when you are talking about this. Now, one of the things that Tracy and I have discussed is that in some ways, with the sort of the royal mistresses that emerge in the 17th and 18th century, that while a sexual relationship is part of that, it's not the only part or even the most important part, that Madame de Pompadour, for example, remains the king's favorite even after their sexual relationship has come to an end. But certainly that existed beforehand. And so it's hard to get inside the head of 17th and 18th century people, but certainly the ways that I have seen it used in those contexts, you are talking about a sexual relationship. And I don't recall seeing the male term in the case of favori to talk about male companions in the case of Louis, but I wasn't really looking for them either. So I can't vouch for that.
Well, I don't think that he's known for having them, is he, Louis XIV?
No, he really doesn't. Yeah.
If you're enjoying this episode of Navigating the French, you may also be interested in our sister podcast, Paris: A State of Mind, where real estate experts Gail and Marie give you all the tips and tricks you need about renting and buying apartments in Paris and beyond. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. You know, when we talk about favorites, these women often were quite powerful in the context of their relationship with the king. Is that something that you find of favorites in all of the courts of Europe, or is there something unique to the position of the French favorite?
So this was really sort of the focus of our book, in a sense, that we did find that the position of the powerful French royal mistress really was unique in Europe as this recognized extraconjugal social position with its own defining features, and most notably the fact that she does have this important political role at court. Now, of course, kings in other countries have mistresses. Basically, they all have mistresses. But in France, what is different is that it does become this tradition. I mean, it becomes this open secret, as we call it, that was made possible by the theatrical nature of court life in France. And this is very different, for example, from court life in Austria or in Spain, where the emperor and king led far more secluded lives. And so you didn't have that sort of theatrical space for the royal mistress to emerge. But in the case of France, because of the theatrical nature of the court, courtiers could act in different roles in different spaces at court. And that's what allows for the royal mistress to emerge in this position. And this is especially the case because in France, the majority of royal mistresses are noble women, and they have other reasons to be at court. Everybody knows who the royal mistress is. You see that very clearly from correspondence and memoirs that people write. But everybody behaves as if all is honorable in public. I mean, in the words of Catherine de Medici, when she was talking about her husband's mistresses, for example. But I think that for a long time, historians had really been reluctant to recognize the political influence of mistresses and actually female courtiers more generally. Louis XIV had once said that he would never allow women to influence his policies. And of course, this is untrue, but too many historians took that at face value. I think also that for a long time, historians had a very narrow understanding of what the political entailed. And that's dominated our understanding of politics for way too long. I mean, it's really important to understand that at the early modern court, especially in France, that in the absence of any strict distinction between formal and informal power, and because power operated within a framework of family and court networks that valued women as mediators and brokers, women really could exercise significant political power. And in some cases, women even hold official positions in the Queen's household. They can acquire significant social capital. So what we see in the French court really is different. This public role that women have, the public nature of court life, and then also the fact that you have these different spaces in which women can exercise power does allow for a very particular configuration to emerge, I think.
I'll just throw one other thing in there, and that's, as Chris said, it's an open secret, and I really want to insist on that. The position is unofficial, and it couldn't exist if it were official. It is sort of a paradox, then, that she's often referred to by modern historians as the official mistress, because she's anything but official. By that, I mean something very specific, and that is if you go back to the first really seriously powerful mistress of the King of France, the Duchesse d'Étampes, she is never referred to anything except by her title. So she's always dealing with ambassadors, and so they write back to, say, Henry VIII or to the Emperor Charles V, and they always refer to her, the ambassadors refer to her only as Madame d'Étampes. They don't refer to her as the king's mistress, although presumably everyone knew exactly who she was. I mean, for example, the Duke of Norfolk, who is one of Henry VIII's ambassadors, writes back to Henry VIII, by the way, I was speaking to Marguerite de Navarre, And she's a wonderfully, the sister of the king, she's a wonderfully intelligent woman and so on. And so I asked her, how can I get to the king and get him and persuade him to do what I want him to do? And she says, well, you need to go through the Duchesse d'Étampes. And Norfolk writes, and I was shocked that this sort of woman would be someone I actually need to approach. And I said that to Marguerite de Navarre, but Marguerite said to me, well, I'm only telling you to do what I myself do. So everyone knows who the mistress is, and they understand that they have to access her to access the king, but no one ever comes out and says it. And I assume that in the halls at court, people talked about that and called her all manner of names. But in official correspondence, Diane de Poitiers, same thing. She's always referred to as the Duchesse de Valentinois, never as the king's mistress. And I mentioned that she actually is referred to as la favorite, but retrospectively, during her own lifetime, she's just referred to as la Duchesse. And it's really kind of strange that everyone knows who they are, but there is no name for that position. And then, as Chris was saying, when you move into the 17th century, then the name, the maîtresse du roi, actually becomes fixed. But earlier, I think no one quite knew what to make of the position.
Yeah. And the fact that, as Tracy said, that ambassadors learn that they need to go through the Duchesse d'Étampes or these other women who are the favorites of the king is also related to the fact, of course, that these women are French and the king trusts them. By the 16th century, the wives of kings are foreigners. In all cases, I think after Francis I, which means that kings didn't entirely trust their wives to serve in that intermediary position in the same way, whereas the mistress is French and she's dependent on the king for favor. And if the king succeeds, she succeeds. And so that puts her into a particular position of trust in that way.
Yeah. And here I think we can point back to the existence of the mignon or the favori. It's the same basic idea. The mignon is somebody who the king has made and who is then utterly devoted to the king. So before all other family members, the mignon is the king's man. And I think that at exactly the same time you see the mignon starting to emerge in a serious way, but Charles VII, you see the first serious royal mistress, Agnès Sorel, emerging. So sort of out of the same group of people, a small group of really devoted advisors of King Charles VII. And that carries on. So I think that the mistress is very much implicated in that idea of the courtier that the king favors above all others, and probably unjustly so, because there's always a lot of resentment towards these figures.
One thing that we also talk about in the book that I think is an important thing to make note of is that, the position of the royal mistress as it emerges in France is due to a confluence of a number of factors, including the simultaneous appearance of the mignon, but also a particular idea of gender in France. While women are legally inferior to men, that they are politically as capable, that there is a certain comfort level on the part of kings in relying on women as their advisors. They have their mothers as regents in a lot of cases, and very often mothers are the queen mother is favored as a regent for a young king because due to the invention of Salic law, she cannot become the ruler herself. And so she is seen as the ideal person to advise the king as a young man, and often remains his advisor. So there's this sense that women are politically as capable, but they're not a threat to the king. And so in this way, kings are aware of the fact that women can be particularly valuable as advisors.
Do you get a sense that sort of perception of gender reverberates or echoes in any way in modern France in terms, obviously we've come quite far in terms of the legality of women being in power, but insofar as our conception of gender in France as compared to in other countries where we might have had a court system and no longer do you get the sense that there is any kind of reverberation of that mindset where you would give women so much power, but also recognize them as being quite different than men?
Oh, yeah. This is something that we've actually written on in other contexts as well. This idea of what Mona Zouf refers to as the French singularity, or people call the Gallic singularity, that the relationship between men and women is different and less conflictual in France, that it's based on this sort of complementarity in their roles. And that is something that very much comes out of, I think, the traditional relationship of men and women in France is perceived over the centuries, that women fill a different role, but an equally important role in a sense, and that makes them a good advisor to men in a sense.
Yeah, and it's an idea. Galanterie has been deconstructed over the years by American scholars, English scholars, and more by French scholars as well. But I think that the idea is still so just so alive, because you hear podcast after podcast on it, right? The horrendous ways that Americans are promoting the Me Too type movement, where men and women become enemies. And it's very much present, I think, in France as a debate. For not negligible part of the population, the idea of conversation with women is just an essential part of French identity, and being galant is an essential part of French identity. And I don't really have any parti pris here, because I think that if you know the history, you are more sympathetic towards that idea than otherwise, because it really did allow women a lot of power at a time when women didn't have much power. I mean, I recognize the debates and I understand how important they are, but at the same time, when you have this history of that as a way for women to exercise power, you can understand how that got woven into the French identity, especially in the 19th century when histories were being written, when the history of France was being written for the first time. Those women were an essential part of that history.
Yeah, I mean, that's been a really interesting thing to both of us, is this way that women are worked into the French national story by historians in the 19th century with the professionalization of history. I mean, this is the way that women become a part of that history in a sense.
If you're enjoying this podcast, you may enjoy our sister podcast, City of Muses, which is brand new to the Paris Underground Radio Network. Each week, join City of Muses host Jennifer Garrity as she sits down with contemporary artists, poets, dancers, designers, and performers to explore what inspires them, where their ideas come from, and how Paris has helped or hindered their dreams come true. Inspiration and creativity meet in Paris, the City of Muses. Check out City of Muses now, available wherever you listen to podcasts. Navigating the French will be right back after a word from our sponsors. And now, back to Navigating the French. Well, I mean, and that brings me to my final question for you, which is, in your work, you've obviously both together and separately explored the depth and the breadth, the power of these very powerful women in many cases. Could you each maybe share a bit about one of your favorite powerful French favorites from history and why she stands out to you?
I would say that my very favorite favorite is actually Anne Boleyn. I mean, she's just an amazing character. So she spends her early years either from 7 to 14 or from 14 to 21, depending on when she was born. No one really quite knows whether she was born in about 1500 or 1507. So she spends her early years at the court of François Ier and Queen Claude and becomes a French woman, essentially, and then goes back to England and becomes the favorite of Henry VIII. I mean, she functions exactly as a mistress for about 6 years before they finally get married. And she is able to express her opinions and influence Henry VIII in a way that nobody else ever did. And I'm working on Anne Boleyn at this moment, and just a really fascinating story. So she is my favorite favorite, and I justify that because she was at the French court for so many years.
So for me, it's actually Madame de Montespan. And, probably Madame de Pompadour is the best known royal mistress. I mean, because she was so openly the conduit to Louis XV's favor. But Montespan, I think, is the one who really sort of took hold of the role and brought it to its full expression in a sense. Montespan was from one of the oldest and most important noble families in France, and she's known for being beautiful, but also for her wit and her magnificence, that she was really intelligent. And one of the things that historians have noted is that her reign at court really corresponds with the most glorious and successful period of Louis's reign. She really is his favorite from about 1667 maybe until the late 1670s. And like I said, she really gives full expression to the position. She brings panache and brilliance to the role. She's a very skilled political player, and courtiers, even actually on occasion the Queen, Maria Theresa, we turn to Montespan for favors and for positions at court. So she's a very important patron and broker. And in fact, some courtiers complain about her influence in diplomatic and military affairs as well. So she's the one who really establishes the position of the royal mistress not only as this political player, but also as an important patron of the arts. She sponsors painters, writers, architects, and she also becomes a fashion trendsetter at a time when the French are becoming increasingly known as a center of fashion. The other thing I guess I find interesting about her too is that, she and Louis have both a very passionate relationship and a very complicated relationship. I mean, they break up, they get back together, and so she's just a really fascinating individual in many ways.
Amazing. Well, I mean, thank you all so much. I know we're just scratching the surface here of how much richness there is to this history. So I'm going to put a link in the show notes for anyone who wants to read more about these fascinating women, from these fascinating women, to some of the work that you've published out there in the world. And I hope that everybody enjoys learning even more about these favorites. Thank you both so much for joining me today.
Thank you.
I hope you continue to uncover some interesting things about these fascinating women through history.
Thanks, Emily.
Yes, thank you so much for inviting us today.
This has been Navigating the French. You can find more from me, Emily Monaco, at Emily_in_France on Twitter and Instagram. This podcast is produced by Paris Underground Radio. To listen to other episodes of this podcast, or to discover more podcasts like it, please visit parisundergroundradio.com. Thanks for listening, and à bientôt.
This episode of Navigating the French was produced by Jennifer Garrity for Paris Underground Radio. For more great content, join us on Patreon at patreon.com/Paris Underground Radio.